One tip I'd like to show you is after you've got your pattern printed and cut out, I like to use a piece of tissue paper and I trace over the pattern piece, and I use the tissue paper for actually cutting out the embroidered fabric. And the reason that I do this is so that I can see the embroidery through the tissue paper and get it lined up just the way I want it. Here's a glove I've already made, of course. Now when you lay it under the tissue paper, you can slightly see the embroidery through it, and you can line up your embroidery just the way you want it then. You could also use like a vellum paper. It may not be long enough for the big mitten, but you could tape two pieces together. I have piece B and C pinned together, right sides together, and I'm going to sew around this edge that has the thumb on it. Now I've got piece A and piece B and C that are sewn together, and I'm going to place these right sides together, and I will pin around the edges and sew around this outside edge. If you're making the longer mittens that go up higher on the wrist, you'll want to cut a 4-inch piece of elastic and pin it onto the back side here in between the two notches and sew it on so that it'll gather that back a little bit. But on these shorter mittens, I'm not going to do that. If you want to have your mittens lined, you just sew the lining together exactly the same way that you did the mittens, but you use just a slightly larger seam allowance, and that will make the lining just a little bit smaller to fit inside the mittens. And it's what you would do with your lining and your outside mitten, is you would take them and pin the upper edge together, but leave an opening when you do this, and sew around the upper edge, and then turn them right side out and simply sew the opening closed with a needle and thread. When you're finished sewing your mittens together, you can either put a pom-pom fringe around the upper edge of the mittens, or you can do a decorative stitch, and I'm going to show you how to do both. I have my fringe made and I'm sewing it to the outside edge of the top of the mitten, and I'm just using a slip stitch to do this. You want to make sure that you catch the ribbon from the fringe when you're doing this. strips cut from the printed cardstock to make the pom-pom fringe with, and I'm going to start out by cutting a small slit in one end, just a really small slit, and I'm going to take the yarn and I'm going to put it through the small slit. Now I'm going to start wrapping the cardstock strip with the yarn. Now if you want variegated colors throughout, you can either buy the variegated yarn, or you can do what I'm doing here. I'm going to cut another small slit, put the yarn up through it, cut the end, and get my next color of yarn and start in that same slit by putting the end through it. And then I'll wrap some more yarn. When you come to the end, just cut another small slit in the cardstock strip at the end, pull your yarn through, and then trim it. Now I'm going to cut a piece of 1/8 inch wide ribbon, a little longer than the strip of wrapped cardstock, and I'll place it in the middle, and then I will sew with the sewing machine down the middle of the strip. I've sewn a ribbon down the center. It's a 1/8 inch wide ribbon, and now I'm going to fold up the cardstock along the edges, and this is just so I can get the scissors tip in under the yarn. Then I'll take the scissors, stick it in underneath the yarn, and cut down the edge. I've cut the yarn down both edges, and now I'm going to tear out the cardstock. And it tears out really easy. I do that to both sides. Now we have some fringe to sew on the mittens. If you are making the really large mittens that come up quite a ways on the arm, you may want to use more than one strip of the cardstock and tape it together so that you have enough fringe. I use a little scrub brush to brush out the fringe to get it to look nice and fuzzy, and I do it very gently so as to not pull out any little strips of yarn. And I spend quite a bit of time just brushing this and getting it to look just right. Now I have it all brushed so it's fuzzy, and sometimes I like to trim it off a little bit. As you can see, there are some longer pieces of yarn that hang out a little bit, and I just kind of give it a haircut. Now I will sew this to the top outside edge of the mittens, and I'll use needle and thread and just use a simple slip stitch going around to sew it on. Great part about this trim is you could use this on just about anything. You could use it on clothing or quilts or pillows, or it just is a really fun little way to add something extra to your project.